The air smelled of smoke and metal. Earth had lost the war. Commander Doran Kane stood in the grand hall of the Valeri Imperial Palace, wrists bound in shimmering cuffs that suppressed his strength. Around him, towering alien warriors in silver armor washed with unreadable expressions. The hall was massive, lined with dark pillars carved with symbols of conquest. At its center, on a throne of obsidian, sat the ruler of Earth's new masters, Empress Ciara. She was not what Kane had expected. Her long, silver-white hair cascaded down her back, framing a face both beautiful and intimidating. Her violet eyes glowed faintly, sharp as a predator's, and a golden circlet rested on her forehead, marking her royal status. Unlike her soldiers, she wore no heavy armor, only a sleek, flowing black and gold robe that hinted at power rather than brute strength. Kane refused to kneel. Even in defeat, his pride as a soldier remained intact. Ciara tilted her head, amused. "You defy me, even now." Her voice was smooth but carried the weight of command. "I admire that." Kane said nothing. He had spent years fighting the Valeri invasion, watching cities fall, seeing friends die, and now he stood before their queen, a trophy of war. Ciara stood gracefully, descending the steps of her throne with slow, deliberate movements. She stopped just a few feet from Kane and studied him like a scientist examining a rare specimen. "Commander Kane, your resistance was impressive. Humanity fought well, but the outcome was inevitable." Kane's jaw tightened. "If you expect me to beg for mercy, you'll be disappointed." Ciara chuckled. A low, rich sound. "Mercy? No, I have a far more interesting proposition for you." She turned slightly, glancing at the high-ranking Valeri officials seated along the hall's edge. Their expressions remained carefully neutral, but Kane sensed the tension beneath their silence. "Earth is mine," Ciara continued, "but securing a throne is not the same as keeping it. My empire is vast, and not all of my kind agree with my rule. Some believe I should have wiped out humanity completely." Kane clenched his fists. He had no doubt that many Valeri saw humans as nothing more than pests. Ciara's gaze softened just slightly, though the sharp intelligence in her eyes remained. "But I see potential. I see strength." She took another step forward. "And I need an ally." Kane frowned. "Ally?" A smirk touched her lips. "Consort, you will stand at my side, not as a slave, but as my chosen mate." The words hit him like a shockwave. He had prepared for death, for imprisonment, even torture. But this, "I'd rather die." His voice was cold. Ciara laughed, as if she had expected his answer. "Brave words, but do you truly wish to see your people suffer needlessly?" "The war is over, Kane. Your choices are simple. Stand beside me and ensure humanity's survival, or refuse, and watch your world burn." A heavy silence fell over the hall. The watching Valeri warriors did not move, waiting for their empress's command. Kane's mind raced. He could see the trap clearly. This was not a romantic offer, but a strategic one. If she truly wanted an earthling by her side, it was because it gave her political leverage, a symbol of unity between conqueror and conquered. And yet there was something else in her gaze, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even respect. He gritted his teeth. "And if I refuse?" Ciara lifted a hand. A glowing screen appeared in midair, displaying a live feed of Earth's cities. Her voice was quiet, but her words were absolute. "Then humanity will learn what true defeat looks like." Kane looked at the image of his ruined world. Smoke rose from shattered skyscrapers, and his people, were forced to kneel before their new rulers. His pride screamed at him to reject her, to spit in the face of the woman who had taken everything from him. But pride alone would not save Earth. Ciara extended a hand. "Decide, Kane. Stand with me, or let your world burn." The weight of the choice pressed down on him, and deep down, he knew his war was not over yet. Commander Doran Kane stood motionless, his heart pounding. He had faced death 100 times before, on the battlefield, in the ruins of fallen cities. But never like this. Empress Xiara held out her hand, waiting for his answer. The air in the grand hall was thick with silence. The Velari warriors surrounding them remained still, their glowing eyes watching closely. They wanted to see if the human would kneel or die. Kane's jaw tightened. He had fought against this empire for years. Accepting Xiara's offer felt like betrayal, yet the image of his broken world flashed in his mind. If he refused, Earth would suffer. Slowly, he raised his head and met Xiara's gaze. "I'll stand with you," he said, his voice steady. "But if you think that makes me yours, you're wrong." Xiara's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "We shall see." She turned without another word, walking toward the exit. The guards unfastened Kane's restraints and stepped back, as if daring him to try something. He didn't. He had already made his choice. Xiara led him through the massive palace halls. The floors gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting the soft golden light from above. Strange, floating symbols lined the walls. Velari writing, ancient and unreadable to him. "This isn't a prison, Kane," Xiara said as they walked. "You are free to explore the palace, but know this, my people are watching." "Not much of a choice, is it?" Kane muttered. Xiara glanced at him with amusement. "You are not a prisoner. You are my consort." The word sent a strange chill down his spine. "I didn't agree to be your consort," he said, his voice firm. Xiara's smirk deepened. "Didn't you?" They stepped through an archway into an open-air courtyard. Unlike the cold, metallic interiors of the palace, this place was filled with strange alien trees, their twisting branches glowing softly in the evening light. A grand balcony overlooked the Velari capital, a vast city of towering spires and shimmering energy bridges that stretched across the sky. "This is my world, Kane," Xiara said, watching the city below. A place of power, of order. Earth was chaotic, wild, full of wasted potential. Now it belongs to something greater. Kane folded his arms. "And you think standing next to you makes me part of that?" She turned to face him, her violet eyes studying him closely. "It makes you important. More than you were as a soldier, more than you would be as a defeated warrior." Kane frowned. He didn't like the way she said it, as if he was nothing before. He had fought, bled, and lost more than she could ever understand. Before he could respond, a Velari general approached. A tall, imposing man with silver skin and glowing blue eyes. His armor bore the sigil of the Empire, and the air around him seemed to hum with authority. "Your Majesty," the general said, bowing his head. Then his gaze flicked to Kane, his expression unreadable. "The High Council demands an audience. They are displeased." Xiara sighed, as if this was expected. "Of course they are." She turned to Kane. "Come, you should see what happens when an empress makes an unpopular decision." Kane followed, his instincts on high alert. He had no doubt that Xiara's people hated the idea of a human at her side. The question was, how far would they go to stop it? As they walked, Kane glanced at Xiara. She was a conqueror, a ruler of entire worlds. And yet, she had chosen him. For what reason, he didn't fully understand. One thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Commander Doran Kane followed Empress Xiara into the Grand Council chamber, his every sense on high alert. The room was massive, built from dark, polished stone that shimmered with embedded strands of golden light. Around a long curved table sat the Velari High Council, a dozen powerful figures, each more intimidating than the last. Their piercing, glowing eyes turned toward him, their expressions cold and unreadable. A woman with sharp, angular features and silver blue skin leaned forward. She wore elaborate robes woven with strands of light, marking her as someone important. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice laced with disapproval. "We summoned you to discuss your reckless actions, not to meet your human pet." Kane's fists clenched, but before he could respond, Shiara's voice rang through the chamber, calm, but razor-sharp. "Mind your words, Counselor Cilia," Shiara warned. "He is not a pet. He is my chosen consort." A murmur spread through the chamber, disbelief and outrage simmering beneath the surface. An older Valari male with glowing violet eyes, likely a senior counselor, narrowed his gaze. "You dishonor our empire," he said. "Taking a human as consort, it is an insult to our bloodline, to centuries of purity." Sayara met his gaze without flinching. "The empire is mine to shape," she said. "And if you believe tradition outweighs power, then perhaps you've forgotten who I am." A heavy silence followed. Kane could almost feel the tension in the air. Another counselor, a broad-shouldered warrior with golden tattoos running along his arms, spoke next. "We respect your rule, Empress," he said, his tone careful. "But this choice will bring unrest. The Empire does not see humans as equals. The people will not accept him." Sayara tilted her head. "Then they will learn." Kane's mind raced. He was used to battlefields, not royal politics, but even he could see the danger in Tiara's defiance. The Valari were not happy, and unhappy rulers often turned into enemies. The counselor named Cilia stood, her robes swirling around her. "Perhaps we should let the humans speak," she suggested, her voice dripping with mockery. "Tell us, Kane, why should we accept you?" All eyes turned to him. Kane exhaled slowly, stepping forward. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't even sure why he was here. But he wouldn't stand there like some helpless bystander. "I didn't ask for this," Kane said, his voice steady. "I didn't ask to be here. But I know one thing. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to respect me. But if you think I'm weak, if you think I'll just stand here and let you trample over me, you're wrong." The chamber remained silent. Then Cilia laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "How charming," she sneered. "A human with fire." Kane had the distinct feeling that he had just painted a target on his back. Ciara's eyes flickered with approval as she placed a hand on Kane's arm, a silent show of support. "The council may not accept this now," she said, her voice softer but firm. "But time will prove my decision was right." The older counselor frowned. "Time is not your ally, Empress," he said gravely. "Many do not agree with you, and some may act on their displeasure." A warning. Kane met Ciara's gaze. She didn't look surprised. She already knew. As they left the chamber, Kane finally spoke. "That was a threat." Ciara gave a small smile. "Of course." Kane exhaled, shaking his head. "You really know how to make friends." Ciara's eyes gleamed. "It's not friends I need, Kane. It's power." And in that moment, Kane realized, this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about survival. Kane had faced death many times before. He had fought on the front lines, watched soldiers fall beside him, and felt the weight of battle press against his soul. But here, in the Valari royal palace, he felt something different. The silent war. Ciara's enemies weren't marching toward her with guns or ships. They were watching, waiting, plotting. The palace was beautiful. Tall crystalline pillars stretched high above, glowing veins of golden energy pulsing through them like the lifeblood of a living world. Yet beneath its elegance, Kane sensed the danger lurking within its walls. And that danger struck that very night. Kane had trouble sleeping. He lay on a bed softer than anything he'd ever known, but his instincts wouldn't let him rest. Something felt off. Then he heard it. A faint metallic click. The sound of a door being unlocked from the outside. His muscles tensed. He reached for the dagger he kept under his pillow, just as the door silently slid open. Two figures stepped inside. They were Vaylari assassins, their dark suits absorbing the ambient light, making them look like shadows. Their eyes glowed softly, one violet, one deep gold. No words, no hesitation. They moved fast. Kane rolled off the bed, just as a thin, curved blade slashed through the air, where his throat had been seconds ago. His body reacted before his mind could fully catch up, military training kicking in. He ducked low, grabbed the assassin's wrist, and twisted hard. A sharp grunt. The blade clattered to the floor. But the second assassin was already lunging. Kane had no time to dodge. He braced for the impact. A blast of violet energy struck the assassin midair, sending him crashing into the wall. Kane spun around. Sayara stood in the doorway, her long dark robes billowing, her glowing eyes burning with raw fury. Her hands crackled with energy, her breathing controlled, but her expression murderous. The first assassin recovered, reaching for another weapon. Sayara moved like lightning. She raised a hand, and in an instant, the assassin's entire body froze. His muscles locked, his breath hitched, his own blade hovering inches from his chest. "Who sent you?" Sayara's voice was calm, too calm. The assassin's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. His golden eyes stared at her with defiance. Kane didn't like that look. A second later, the assassin's body convulsed, his pupils dilated. Then he collapsed, lifeless. Poison. The other assassin, still groaning from Sayara's attack, managed a bitter laugh before his own body went limp. They had taken their own lives. A cold silence filled the room. Sayara exhaled slowly. "It begins," she murmured. Kane clenched his fists. "They knew they'd die," he said. "Whoever sent them, they have no fear." Sayara turned to him, her sharp, elegant features shadowed by the dim glow of the palace lights. "They fear something," she said, "but not death. Me." She stepped closer, placing a hand on Kane's chest, right over his heartbeat. "This is only the first move," she warned. "They won't stop." Kane met her gaze. "Then neither will we." Sayara's lips curled into the smallest smile. "That," she said, "is why I chose you." Outside, the twin moons of the Vaylari homeworld shone brightly, casting a silver glow over the palace. But Kane knew a storm was coming. Kane tightened his grip on the dagger as the bodies of the assassins lay motionless on the cold crystal floor. The attack was over, but the danger had only just begun. Sayara stood beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of the palace walls. She was calm, too calm. "They were elite," Kane muttered. "Trained, disciplined. They knew exactly where to strike." Sayara nodded. This wasn't a test. It was a warning. A low chime echoed through the chamber. Moments later, Commander Valus entered. His silver armor gleamed under the lights, and his sharp, angular features were unreadable. Behind him, two guards followed, their weapons drawn. "What happened?" Valus demanded, his piercing blue gaze shifting from the assassins to Sayara. "They came for me," she said, folding her arms. "And they failed." Valus studied the scene, then turned to Kane. His expression remained neutral, but Kane saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt. Distrust. "You allowed this?" Valus asked, voice edged with challenge. Kane clenched his jaw. "I handled it." Valus let out a slow breath before looking at Sayara again. "Your Majesty, this proves what we already knew. There are those who will never accept your choice. They see your bond with him as—" He shot a glance at Kane. A threat. Sayara's expression remained unreadable. "They will have to live with it." Valus hesitated, then took a step closer. "And if they refuse?" Sayara met his gaze. "Then they will die with it." Cain respected her strength, but he knew this wasn't just about her decision to be with him. There was something deeper. Later, inside the private chambers of the palace, Cain sat across from Sayara as she traced her fingers along the edge of a holographic map. It displayed Valeri territories, trade routes, and strongholds, but Cain noticed certain sectors were marked in red. "What are these?" he asked. Sayara's gaze followed his. "Loyalist factions," she said. "They refuse to acknowledge my rule. And after tonight, they will only grow bolder." Cain frowned. "This isn't just about us, is it?" Sayara leaned back. For the first time since the attack, she looked tired. "My father ruled with absolute power," she admitted. "No one questioned his decisions, even when they led to war. Now they look at me and see weakness. They think because I've chosen an outsider." She stopped herself, but Cain understood. "They think I've made you soft," he finished. Sayara let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. If only they knew. Cain folded his arms. "So what happens next? You said this was only the first move." She tapped the map, and the red zones expanded. "There will be another attack," she said. "Not assassins next time. A full coup." Cain exhaled sharply. "They'd overthrow you." "They would try." Chiara met his gaze. "Unless we strike first." There was no hesitation in her voice. No doubt. This wasn't a queen clinging to power. This was a warrior preparing for war. Cain ran a hand through his hair. He had fought countless battles, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for her. Sayara reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "This isn't your war." Cain held her gaze. He could have walked away. He could have left this palace, this world, and returned to the simple life of a soldier for hire. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. "You're wrong," he said. "This is my war now." Sayara's fingers tightened around his, and for the first time that night, her fierce expression softened. "Then we fight together," she whispered. Outside, the golden towers of the palace shimmered beneath the twin moons, but in the shadows, unseen forces were already preparing their next move. And when they struck, Cain and Sayara would be ready. Cain stood on the balcony of the palace, staring at the massive city below. Towers of crystal and metal rose high into the sky, their surfaces glowing under the twin moons. From up here, everything looked peaceful, but he knew better. War was coming. Sayara joined him, her royal armor now reforged, sleek, silver, and fitted with dark red battle markings that signified a ruler who would not surrender. Her golden eyes gleamed as she scanned the city. "They've made their move," she said. "We intercepted a transmission. The traitors are gathering their forces at the northern sector." Cain turned to her. "How many?" Sayara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Thousands." He exhaled. "That's not a coup, Sayara. That's an army." She nodded. "And we will crush them." Cain had seen her fight before. She was fast, brutal, unstoppable. But this wasn't a personal battle. It was a war for the throne. Sayara moved closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We strike first," she said. "We hit them before they can march on the palace." Cain studied her face. She was determined, but there was something deeper in her eyes, something she wasn't saying. "This isn't just about the throne, is it?" he asked. Sayara hesitated, then looked away. "No," she admitted. "It's about proving I deserve it." Cain understood. If she showed weakness now, her enemies would never stop coming. They wouldn't just take her crown. They would take her life. The battlefield. The night was alive with fire and shadows. Cain stood alongside Shiara's forces, Valeri warriors in sleek combat suits, their weapons humming with energy. Drones hovered above, scanning the ruins of the northern sector where the enemy had gathered. Sierra raised her arm, a silent command. The first strike hit fast, aerial bombardments shattering enemy defenses. The ground trembled as explosions rippled through the district, but Kane knew it wouldn't be enough. The real fight was about to begin. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air. Kane turned just in time to see enemy soldiers charging from the dust and fire. They were armored, their helmets hiding their faces, their weapons glowing with unstable energy. And they were fast. "Hold the line." Shiara's voice rang out across the battlefield. Kane drew his rifle, firing into the oncoming force. A soldier lunged at him. He twisted, dodged, and drove his blade into the warrior's side. The enemy collapsed, but more followed. Beside him, Sayara fought like a force of nature. Her energy blade cut through armor like paper. She spun, dodged, and struck with precision, her golden eyes burning with fierce determination. But there were too many. Kane took down another enemy, then heard a sudden explosion behind him. He turned, and his stomach dropped. The palace's outer shield had been breached. Sayara saw it too. Her jaw tightened. "They planned this," she said. The northern sector was a distraction. Kane's grip tightened on his rifle. "They're going for the palace." Sayara wasted no time. "We move. Now." She turned, shouting orders to her commanders. The battlefield was chaos, but Kane only focused on one thing, staying at her side. Together, they ran toward the palace. The final stand. The palace was under attack. Explosions ripped through the outer halls, sending shards of crystal and metal flying. Kane and Sayara pushed forward, cutting down enemy warriors as they stormed through the corridors. The throne room was just ahead. If the enemy took it, the war would be over. They reached the massive golden doors, only to find them already open. Inside stood Valus. Sayara froze. Kane lifted his rifle. Valus wasn't alone. He stood at the foot of the throne, surrounded by high-ranking nobles and warriors. He wasn't just a commander. He was the traitor. Sayara's eyes darkened. "So this is how you honor my father's legacy." Valus didn't flinch. "Your father would never have chosen a human over his empire." Kane took a step forward, his finger on the trigger. "And yet she's still standing, while your assassins are dead." Valus smirked. "Not all of them." Before Kane could react, a blade shot toward Sayara's back. She turned, but she was a second too late. Kane moved. Fast. He grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisting hard until the knife dropped. Then, without thinking, he drove his own blade forward, straight into the assassin's chest. The enemy crumpled. Sayara looked at Kane, her eyes wide. He had saved her life. But there was no time for words. Valus stepped forward, drawing his sword. "I had hoped this could be bloodless," he said. "But if you will not surrender." Sayara raised her blade. "Then you will die." The final battle for the throne had begun. Kane gripped his weapon tightly, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The throne room was eerily silent, despite the battle raging outside. Sayara stood before Valus, her golden eyes burning with fury. Her energy blade hummed in her hand, casting a cold blue glow across the shattered marble floor. Valus smirked. "You were never meant to rule, Sayara," he said. "The Empire needs a true leader, not a queen blinded by weakness." Sayara's jaw tightened. "You call love a weakness. That is why you will never be strong enough to lead." Valus lifted his sword, a long, serrated blade pulsating with red energy. "Enough words. Let's finish this." With blinding speed, Valus lunged. Sayara met his strike, their weapons clashing in a flash of energy. Sparks flew as they traded blow after blow, each strike faster than the last. Kane stepped back, keeping his rifle raised. He wanted to help, but this was Sayara's fight. If she didn't defeat Valus herself, the nobles would never accept her rule. She had to prove she was stronger. Valus swung low, aiming for her legs. Sayara flipped backward, dodging effortlessly. She landed and countered with a powerful strike. Valus barely blocked in time. The impact sent him staggering. Kane could see it. Sayara was faster. She fought with precision, every move calculated. But Valus fought like a beast, brutal and relentless. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to kill. A desperate gamble. Outside, the sounds of battle grew louder. The palace walls shook as enemy forces pushed forward. Kane turned toward the open doors. If the rebels stormed the throne room while Sayara was still fighting, they wouldn't stand a chance. He made a choice. He had to hold the line. Kane ran to the entrance, positioning himself between the throne room and the incoming forces. He aimed his rifle and fired. The first wave of enemy soldiers rushed forward. Kane took down 2 before they reached the door. The third lunged at him with a blade. He barely dodged in time. They were too many. He fired again, but they kept coming. He slammed the butt of his rifle into an enemy's face, then kicked another aside. But he was outnumbered. Behind him, Sayara and Valus clashed again. Sayara spun, her blade slicing across Valus's arm. He growled in pain, but instead of retreating, he pressed forward. "You're hesitating," Valus sneered. "You won't strike to kill." Sayara gritted her teeth. He was right. Even now, after everything, she still saw him as the man who once swore to protect the Empire. But he had betrayed her. He had betrayed everything. Her grip tightened on her blade. No more mercy. The final blow. Kane fell back as another enemy tackled him, slamming him against the wall. His vision blurred as a fist struck his jaw. He struggled, reaching for his weapon. A flash of blue light. The enemy soldier froze, then collapsed, a deep wound burning across his chest. Kane looked up. Sayara stood above him, her blade dripping with energy. Her breathing was heavy, her golden eyes fierce. Behind her, Valus lay on the floor, unmoving. Kane pushed himself up. "You did it." Sayara nodded, but there was no relief in her face, only exhaustion. The battle wasn't over. More enemy soldiers flooded into the throne room. But this time, Sayara didn't hesitate. She raised her blade. For the Empire, her warriors stormed in behind her. The final battle had begun. Blades clashed. Energy bolts streaked through the throne room. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of burning metal, and the cries of warriors locked in battle. Kane stood at Sayara's side, rifle raised, fighting for his life. Enemy soldiers stormed forward, but Sayara's loyalists pushed back. The rebels, leaderless after Valus's fall, fought with desperation but lacked strategy. Kane fired a shot, taking down an enemy rushing toward Sayara's back. She barely turned, her golden eyes meeting his for a second. A silent thank you. A roar broke through the chaos. One of Valus's remaining generals, a towering alien with obsidian armor, charged toward Sayara. His twin plasma axes glowed, slicing through the air with lethal speed. Kane barely had time to shout. Sayara dodged left, but the second axe came too fast. Kane threw himself forward. Pain exploded in his side as the axe scraped his ribs, cutting deep into his armor. He hit the ground hard, gasping. Sayara's eyes flared. She spun, her energy blade humming, and in one clean motion, struck the general down. The enemy forces hesitated. Without their leaders, they faltered. Sayara raised her blade high. "The rebellion ends here. Surrender, and you will live. Resist, and you will fall." The room fell silent. One by one, the enemy soldiers dropped their weapons. It was over. The price of war. Kane struggled to sit up, pain flaring through his ribs. Sayara knelt beside him, her face full of concern. "You fool," she murmured, pressing a hand to his wound. You didn't have to do that. He chuckled weakly. Wouldn't be much of a husband if I let you fight alone. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. Relief. He had made it. The Loyalists moved swiftly, securing the palace. The remaining rebels were captured. The Empire, though shaken, had a queen once more. But Tayara had changed. She had seen the corruption in the Empire, the cruelty that led to this war. She would not rule the same way her ancestors did. She turned to her people. Today, we do not just restore a throne. We rebuild a better empire, one where power is not taken, but earned, where loyalty is not forced, but given freely. The hall erupted in cheers. Cain smiled. She would be a great queen. A future together. Days passed. The empire was stabilizing. Peace talks had begun. Cain stood on the palace balcony, gazing at the alien sky. The twin moons glowed softly, casting silver light over the city below. He had never imagined this life. A soldier from Earth, now a war hero on an alien world. A husband to a queen. He heard soft footsteps behind him. Zayara wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his back. "Are you happy?" she asked. He turned, meeting her gaze. Golden eyes, full of warmth. "With you? Always." She smiled, but there was something else in her expression. "I made a decision," she said. "One that won't be easy." Cain frowned. "What is it?" She took his hands. "I won't be like my ancestors. The empire has been ruled by force for too long. It's time for something different." He studied her face. Determined. Strong. And yet, beneath it all, a flicker of uncertainty. "What are you planning?" he asked. She exhaled. "I want to end the war between our worlds." Cain's eyes widened. Peace between Earth and the Empire. It was a dream, one neither side believed possible. But if anyone could make it happen, it was Ciara. She lifted his hand to her lips. "Will you stand with me?" Cain smiled. "Always." Together, they gazed at the stars. A new future ahead.